I think there were a lot of reasons. I think perhaps the main reason was I can relate to him. Because he was shy, he wasn't that successful with girls, he had to worry about his family. I think most teenagers reading it thought to themselves, hey, that could be me, you know. So there certainly was that identification.
Once again, Spider-Man has continued to prove why he's one of the most iconic figures in pop culture. Even if you ignore the TV shows and video games, it's hard to not notice Spider-Man's impact on our world today. Although the character has been massively popular for years, the films have arguably added significantly to his worldwide acclaim. While some fans consider Tobey Maguire the greatest Spider-Man, others believe that Tom Holland is the definitive version of the character. You may even be among the 3 people who loved Reeve Carney's interpretation of Spider-Man. But let's be honest, no one does.
The Washington Post, shrill, insipid mess. What did you guys think when you read these?
Regardless of who your favorite Spider-Man is, it's pretty clear that each version has highlighted different aspects of the timeless character. This video isn't about who's the best Spider-Man, but a celebration of every live-action adaptation so far.
Can't see! There are cars there, motherfucker!
Believe it or not, but the first appearance of Spider-Man in live action was in an unauthorized fan film. Created by writer Donald F. Glut, Spider-Man first appeared in the 2006 documentary, I Was a Teenage Movie Maker. The film followed a simple plot involving Spider-Man fighting Dr. Lightning, a villain who had recently kidnapped his own daughter. Since this was a fan film, the short was incredibly DIY, utilizing simple filmmaking techniques to make up for the lack of budget. There was another Spider-Man fan film released 5 years later. However, this time it was officially endorsed by Stan Lee himself. Adapting the comic book The Amazing Spider-Man number 15, Spider-Man vs. Kraven the Hunter, released in 1974. Unfortunately, no footage of the fan film exists online, as director Bruce Cardozo refused any online publication of his film. As a result, the only look we have of the film are these 4 photos published in Foom magazine.
Nobody knows who you are.
Spider-Man made his official live-action appearance on The Electric Company, a show aimed at improving the reading skills of young children. As a result, Spider-Man never seemed to speak a single line of dialogue in the entire series. Instead, dialogue is presented through speech bubbles like a living comic book. Although this was Spider-Man's first official live-action appearance, there was nothing special about this interpretation of the character. Since he was supposed to be as idealized as possible, the stories always seemed to follow simple good versus evil plots, and were presented in a unique comic-like format, intercutting between live-action sequences and comic-like illustrations. The action did leave a lot to be desired, however, and the sketches lacked any form of recognizable Spider-Man villains. Spider-Man's appearances on The Electric Company were quite popular among young viewers, so to take advantage of his success on a small screen, Stan Lee and Marvel Comics sold the television rights to CBS, who immediately began work on a primetime TV series. Spider-Man began life as a 90-minute TV movie, starring Nicholas Hammond as the lead role. Upon its release in 1977, the series became the network's highest-performing program of the year. In fact, this series was so popular that it spawned its own 13-episode TV series, which were later repackaged and released as 3 films internationally: Spider-Man, Spider-Man Strikes Back, and Spider-Man Dragon's Challenge. Although these films were impressive at the time of their release, modern audiences would come to notice just how dated these films are today. Not only were the action scenes incredibly bland to look at, but due to budgetary limitations, many of Spider-Man's more fantastical villains never made it into the films. Instead, we get original villains who are boring and have generic, uninspired motivations. The series also had no interest in staying faithful to the source material, with many of Spider-Man's supporting cast being replaced by original characters. Although Nicholas Hammond puts on a decent performance as Peter Parker, he never seems to go through any kind of noticeable character arc. This is due to the fact that these Spider-Man films have no interest in telling a compelling story. In fact, these films have no interest in even maintaining continuity to begin with. Plot points from other films are never mentioned, characters constantly shift personalities, and even change appearances due to actors not returning to their roles. Stan Lee himself has gone on to criticize the series for being too juvenile, even getting into fights with the producer about which direction to take the series. It seems this criticism was warranted, because the Spider-Man series never seemed to resonate with older audiences, which in the end led to its cancellation. In the late 1970s, Marvel Comics made an interesting agreement with the Toei company. Simply put, the deal meant that both companies could use each other's properties with no restrictions whatsoever. This deal was what allowed Toei to introduce their incredibly unique interpretation of Spider-Man. Originally, the series was meant to be a faithful adaptation of the character. However, it was later decided that it would only loosely adapt the source material. I need to place heavy emphasis on the word loosely, because the Japanese Spider-Man series had no interest in following the comics. Not only was Peter Parker replaced by an original character, but his origin story heavily deviated from the source material. Spider-Man no longer gained his powers from a spider bite, but from a bracelet given to him by an alien. His powers were also heavily expanded upon, gaining abilities such as a healing factor, the power to talk to spiders, X-ray vision, increased smell, enhanced hearing, night vision, and future sight. This Spider-Man is also devoid of any web shooters, choosing instead to use the Spider Bracelet, a highly advanced multi-tool with a plethora of different features, including the ability to summon a multitude of vehicles, such as a giant mech suit. Clearly, the Japanese Spider-Man series took some creative liberties with the character. In fact, the purpose of Toei bringing Spider-Man to the small screen was to introduce him into their Super Sentai franchise, a series of kids' TV shows that focus on bright colorful characters, fighting bad guys in a monster of the week type format. This was not a series that took itself seriously, instead it reveled in its own absurdity. And for a show made in the 70s with a low budget, the stunt work and the action sequences never failed to impress me to this day. Surprisingly, the series was very popular in Japan, spawning a total of 42 episodes, a TV movie, and a series of tie-in comic books.
Pizza time.
For years, Spider-Man found relative success on the small screen. However, Marvel Comics always dreamed of having the character make his big screen debut. For 25 years, many directors and writers tried their hand at bringing the character to life. Horror director Tobe Hooper was one of the many people who tried to bring the character to the silver screen. However, his version drifted too far from the source material, envisioning Peter Parker as a scientist who turns into a giant spider monster. James Cameron also tried his hand at a Spider-Man film. However, due to licensing issues and some questionable creative decisions, his film never made it past the script stages. We did get a plethora of high-quality fan films, however, but they only served to intensify hopes for a big-budget film.
Sorry, boys. I'll tell the Kingpin you're all tied up.
It wasn't until Sony Pictures acquired the film rights that the project would finally make significant progress. In 2001, Sam Raimi became attached as director of the film. Raimi had been mostly known for his chaotic low-budget horror films, so to many he seemed like an odd choice to bring Spider-Man to life. However, Sam Raimi had always been a massive fan of Spider-Man for years, and his interpretation of the character would come to surprise even the most die-hard of comic fans. Spider-Man officially hit theaters on May 3rd of 2002 and received unanimous praise across the board. You couldn't go anywhere without seeing Spider-Man's face plastered everywhere. He was on billboards, t-shirts, puzzles, action figures, shoes, umbrellas, luggage, computers, doors. You get the idea. At the time, Spider-Man was the film that everyone had to see, and as for many people, served as my introduction to the character. Spider-Man at the time truly became a worldwide phenomenon, and its subsequent sequels also captured the hearts and minds of an entire generation. The surprising success of the Spider-Man trilogy was thanks to Sam Raimi's love for the character. Each film in the trilogy felt like a love letter to Stan Lee and Ditko's original comic books, injecting a ton of cheesy comic booky moments, while also not being afraid to delve into darker subject matter.
Godspeed, Spider-Man.
Oh.
The visuals were also bright and colorful, and the production design allowed for inventive recreation of famous costumes, adding a sense of originality to the movies while still honoring the source material. The action scenes were also one of the major highlights of these films, mixing practical stunts with computer-generated effects to create some of the best action sequences in a superhero film in general. However, the best element of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man films was not the action, or the production design, or even J.K. Simmons.
Spider-Man won't let me take any more pictures. You've turned the whole city against him.
A fact I'm very proud of.
No, the thing that everyone remembers these films for was Tobey Maguire's performance as Peter Parker. Unlike the past Spider-Man adaptations that portrayed Peter as a one-dimensional character, this iteration of Peter truly showed why so many people resonated with Spider-Man. In the beginning, Peter was a nobody, a nerdy photographer who was made fun of by his classmates. Due to gaining extraordinary powers from a spider bite, Peter finally has the chance to achieve fame, power, and his true love, things that seemed out of reach to him only days prior. However, Peter becomes intoxicated by his excess of power, developing a more egotistical and arrogant personality. Due to abandoning his old values, one of his loved ones is tragically killed. Unable to cope with his overwhelming guilt, Peter takes on the mantle of Spider-Man.
Great power comes great responsibility. Remember that, Pete. Remember that.
However, despite his extraordinary powers, Peter soon learns that his heroic persona brings another downside to his life. He struggles to maintain relationships with his friends. He lives in a rundown apartment which he can barely afford to live in. His grades are constantly going downhill, and his boss never seems to appreciate his work. Being Spider-Man has arguably made his life worse, to the point where he almost gives up on the persona entirely. However, despite the massive downsides, Peter chooses to be Spider-Man. He chooses to sacrifice his own happiness for the safety of others. Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man is defined by his failures, his desperate attempt to live a fruitful life while being rejected at every turn. But it's his ability to endure life and surpass his limitations that truly makes him Spider-Man.
Whatever life holds in store for me, I will never forget these words. With great power comes great responsibility. This is my gift, my curse. Who am I? I'm Spider-Man.
Just don't call me late for dinner, you get it?
Following the release of Spider-Man 3, Sony began work on a sequel. However, due to a lack of enthusiasm for the project, the film would ultimately be scrapped in favor of rebooting the franchise altogether. To differentiate this new series of films from Sam Raimi's version, Sony Pictures decided to take the character in a much more gritty and grounded direction. Directed by Mark Webb, who was known for his smaller indie films, The Amazing Spider-Man released on July 3rd of 2012 to critical acclaim. The film not only reached the heights of the past films, but Mark Webb was given complete creative freedom, allowing for a deeply personal story about a boy who seeks a connection, which in the end allowed for his evolution into Spider-Man.
Nope.
Let's leave this dream world for a second. In reality, The Amazing Spider-Man opened to average reviews across the board, with only a few redeeming qualities. The films were clearly trying to distinguish themselves from the past films. However, due to Sony's interference with Mark Webb's vision, we end up having a film with an identity crisis. However, These films had one redeeming factor to them, and that was thanks to Andrew Garfield's unique interpretation of Peter Parker. Peter in these films was no longer a nerdy photographer, but a skateboarding social outcast who comes across as rebellious and selfish. Even when he dons the costume for the first time, it's not for heroic reasons, but to satisfy his selfish desire for revenge. The boy who was always looked down upon and bullied now uses his own power to prey upon the weak, and he seemed to enjoy every second of it.
Just let me go.
Is that a knife? Is that a real knife?
Yes, it's a real knife.
My weakness, it's small knives.
This rebellious nature to Peter Parker is due to his lack of a father figure. In fact, the driving force behind Peter's entire character in these films is the need to find a father, a person he could relate to and connect with on a personal level. However, due to his selfish actions, the father figures he could have had always pay the ultimate price in the end. Although Peter may come across as a huge ass at times, he's overall still a good-natured boy who stands up for the weak and helps those to achieve their dreams. This kind-hearted side to Peter Parker is the part of his personality that ultimately emerges in the time of need. Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man is defined by a need to find his place in the world. Although many may seem to look down on him for his appearance and demeanor, his willingness to stand up for what's right, despite all the odds stacked against him, is what truly makes him Spider-Man.
Who are you? Spider-Man.
That thing does not obey the laws of physics at all.
In 2014, thousands of internal documents leaked from Sony Pictures. Among these documents were negotiations between Sony Pictures and Marvel Studios discussing plans to introduce Spider-Man into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It wasn't until the release of Captain America Civil War that we'd finally see the MCU's interpretation of the character.
There's Captain America. There's Iron Man. Whoa, look at that new guy. Who's that? Underoos? That's my cue. I gotta go. Those wings carbon fiber?
Is this stuff coming out of you?
That would explain the rigidity-flexibility ratio, which, gotta say, that's awesome.
I don't know if you've been in a fight before, but there's usually not this much talking.
All right, sorry, my bad.
Spider-Man in his first appearance is overconfident, quippy, and seems to treat the battle as more of a fun test of strength than a serious conflict. He never seems to take the battle seriously, leading to him to make stupid mistakes in the process. Captain America Civil War served as a fantastic introduction to Spider-Man, perfectly showcasing how this iteration of the character would be portrayed. A youthful and innocent Spider-Man who is still trying to prove himself in this world of superheroes. However, this desire for attention ends up bringing more consequences than intended. Peter in these films is a boy who seeks recognition, to the point where he records his heroic actions in order to make a name for himself. However, Peter seems tired of just being the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, and seeks to fight even more powerful threats. Thanks to his newfound access to resources provided by Tony Stark, Peter becomes intoxicated by his newfound power. Due to this, he almost causes the deaths of hundreds of people, his own friends and classmates. Seeing the error of his ways, Peter decides to return to his old values. He no longer fights criminals for attention, but because it's genuinely the right thing to do. Although he no longer feels the need to prove himself, Peter must still grapple with the overwhelming responsibility of his mantle. Even when he tries to live a normal life, he realizes that danger seems to follow him wherever he goes. He's not Iron Man, where he can live his life while being a hero. Instead, he's forced to choose between the two sides. When you hear criticisms for Tom Holland's Spider-Man, you might come across the word Iron Man Jr., the idea that Peter has more in common with Iron Man than Spider-Man himself. However, I don't view Spider-Man as a blatant copy of Iron Man, but more as an inverse on the character's arc. While Tony started off as an arrogant playboy, he soon comes to learn the consequences of his actions, deciding to use his resources to protect others. And although he willingly reveals his identity to the public, he has enough experience and resources to protect his loved ones. This is the opposite for Peter. He's not full of himself at the start. Instead, he's humble and eager to save others. However, thanks to Peter's newfound access to resources, he becomes blinded by the excess of power, leading him to put his loved ones in danger. Instead of embracing newer technology to protect his family more effectively, Peter is physically stripped of his suit and is forced to return to a status quo. Instead of giving up his identity to the public, Peter's newfound fame is forced onto him. He has finally achieved his goal of becoming a famous hero, just not in the way he wanted. Peter now sees the burden of his heroic lifestyle, and in Spider-Man No Way Home he must face the consequences of his actions. Tom Holland's Spider-Man is defined by his need for recognition, and to pay the price that such a need brings upon him and his loved ones.
Come on, Spider-Man. Come on, Spider-Man. Come on, Spider-Man. Oh, come on, Spider-Man!
Every version of Spider-Man have formed their own cinematic identity. Due to his ability to capture the hearts and minds of millions, Spider-Man will continue to remain one of the most popular and relatable characters in fiction.